Thanks to Windows on the World.
Bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information, and no conspiracy theories on tonight's show. Windows on the World covered the alternative event to United Nations COP21 in Paris. The climate change agenda is being enforced by the unelected UN and their Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which bases the global warming theory on what is now found to be fraudulent data. The Climate Challenge offered real scientific analysis of the available data and featured experts in the field. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have altered scientific fact and created fraud with their models and projections, which are presented as scientific fact. The talks from the Climate Challenge are available on www.pcc15.org and the Windows on the World YouTube channel. This global enforcement of the climate change agenda by the unelected UN through local government threatens the way of life of everyone on the planet and is to be enforced by global governance through the UN. Windows on the World have covered this and how it is enforced globally through Agenda 21, now rebranded Agenda 2030, with the Vatican also on board. This is about massive taxation, control of population, and the loss of all individual rights, including private transport and property. Check out our article Big Society Change Agents on windowsontheworld.net and the show UN Destroys London on windowsontheworld.net and YouTube. We have covered London's so-called mini Holland schemes, showing how this is being implemented locally in the UK with no public consultation. The speakers at the Climate Challenge included Stuart Agnew, Piers Corbyn, Ed Flaherty, Philip Foster, Roger Helmer, Tom Harris, Donna Laframboise, Viscount Christopher Monckton, Patrick Moore, Niels Axel Morner, Ian Plimer, Murray Selby, Roger Tattersall and many more. The conference also included the founders of the Independent Committee on Geoethics. Here is the founding statement by the Independent Committee on Geoethics. The principles of ethics, to know what is right and what is wrong, are simple. They are deeply rooted in our cultural heritage and education and personal integrity. To live up to these principles is another thing. Here we often fail badly. The ethical principles that refer to nature and natural sciences are coerced by the term geoethics. We realise that ethical principles are often violated in science as well as in society and politics. Increasingly, in connection with marketing and lobbying for large projects, ethical principles have become set aside. Backbiting, book burning, career blighting, obstruction in publication and personal attacks have no place in science, where physical laws and observational facts must always be foremost. There are no goals that justify unfair means of fighting dissidents. Therefore, there is an urgent need for an independent committee on geoethics to promote ethical principles in the earth and planetary sciences and their correct reflection in social and political life. Aims and methods. We will formulate geoethical recommendations and work for their wider acceptance and application in science. We will speak up and use the sword of truth when scientific facts, observational evidence and physical laws are being set aside and when geoethical principles are violated. It's an ethical decision that you guys have made to tell the truth.
Yes.
And the truth is paramount. Nobody is above the law.
No.
All are equal under the law. And you mentioned something very important in your talk, which was prompted by a member of the audience. Okay. They asked, is this fraud? And you said, yes, it is fraud. So, as far as your research goes, can you just introduce very briefly what your area of research is? Because we're going to show your talk linked to this video.
Yeah. I mean, I have been working in many disciplines, but sea level is, of course, my main business. I have been working there since the middle of the 60s, and all the new theories on sea level research I have launched through the years, I think, and I have gone from the local area up to the planetary solar influence. So yes, I know it, and in this case, it was the question about the satellite altimetry, which is a wonderful tool because it opens measurements in the whole of the oceans.
Can you just explain what that is for people?
Okay, you send a satellite around the Earth, measure the distance from the satellite to the water level. And that changes is repeated and repeated, and then you can see how the water level changes both horizontally and vertically. And from those measurements, the mean of all the oceans, they claim, one school says it's 3.2 millimeter rise per year. The other say that it's 2.9. And it's a small difference, but it's and the question is then, are they correct? Because they doesn't conquer with observational facts at all, and not at all. So we see what have they done. To begin with, the first 8 years measurements, when they released it, after all this, so to say, physical correction they needed, it was a straight line with a variability on it. So there was no trend. Then suddenly in 2003 it became a trend. They lifted up the whole previous measured series by 2.3 millimeter per year. So they got a trend. And of course, if they made a correction, they have to tell that they have made a correction, and they didn't do that. And that is a scientific crime. You must do that, and you must specify then, if you can, why you have done it. But when we look at this correction, which have been accelerated a little later, the about 2.5, 2.7 is the total addition they have done. They cannot explain it, they don't do it, and it is in complete disagreement with observation effect. So I looked back on it, and then I could see what they have been doing, and I tried to correlate it back to what it should be without corrections. And then I get from one station 0.65 millimeter per year, and the other 0.45 millimeter. So about 0.5 millimeter is the trend from satellite altimeter, which is in perfect harmony with observational facts. So finally we have got more or less a similar picture from all the various sources of evidence we have. But then, of course, now back to your fraud, is that they have added subjective correction. I mean, you can add correction, but you must specify it. They didn't specify it, and the correction is done in order to get a trend, and that is not good enough. And I think that becomes an illusion, and that makes all that record wrong. And if you now compare all the various sources of information we have, it is a spectrum between 1 millimeter per year and 0 millimeter per year. Somewhere there is the global variability. For sea level, it's not the same all over the world, but that's where. If we have a few areas, we have fantastic possibility of testing it, and I have shown those test areas. And for them, this is of course the highest priority, because there we can test it with time and so on. And this is what my life has been to. And then back also to see the various driving parameters, how you understand it. But yes, this correction is not good.
Well, it's brilliant, your presentation, because you go into the complexities of actually recording sea level. And there's some very, very interesting points in there about previous sea level, and how that was recorded and how you can compare it. So I would suggest that everybody looks at your talk. In conclusion, because I know you've got to leave very soon, just like a few words on what you think the future holds for real science.
Oh, real science. I think when we started the project IPCC in 1987, earlier we were primarily climate and sea level for sure, 100%, were driven by geologists. Then something happened because it was taken over by meteorologists. And instead of having observation, I had computer models. And I think it failed. And it even brought down science into what I call anti-science. It's the opposite to it. And that is terrible for science, because we want to be, we can have different opinions, and wonderful. That is how science goes forward. But you must rely on things which we know, not just put figures from nowhere just so that it fits a model. model are not good enough.
No.
Reality. We have to stick to reality. So, but if we ever can do that, we are trying, like this meeting, we are trying to present real hard facts, scientific data. If that is enough, I don't know. And we tried with this ethical thing, because you have to be, if you lie and say the wrong thing, at least you have to be ashamed. And we can put your finger on that. Now, this is not correct, or you make tremendous exaggerations, and so on.
Well, that's become quite obvious, and it has been revealed in the past with the ClimateGate scandal, but they're going on with it. It's a big corporate agenda which involves everybody on the planet, and it's about taking away rights and property ownership, and basically it's huge taxation. So I'd just like Franco to finish up, because you've been very vocal, and you've come up with some brilliant points. So what would you say to the public out there?
I tell you what I do. I mean, I am geologist, so he said something that I've been doing 55 years around the world, observation. So, I mean, going back to our problem, we have glaciation for us. Glaciation is cold. Then we have a period where it is warm, which we call it interglacial. So there is a period where you change the temperature to go from cold to warmer, so that there is a transitional period. Now, about 25 years ago, the world was stunned by the word global warming, that we geologists, we never used, because we use glaciation is cold, interglacial is warm. And the reason was simple, because you had the possibility of having observation. The glaciation left sediments that the geologists study. So then I tell you what I did, very cunning, and I borrowed the concept of global warming that we geologists never used, and I coupled that to every time the glaciation of any period, 100,000, 250, 1 million, 2 million, 300 million years ago. So every glaciation, to change the temperature, had to have a sort of a global warming. And then I stuck them out, because then global warming, it is not only because of this last glaciation. Every damn glaciation of the world had its own global warming, including the last one, which was about 25, 24, 22,000 years ago. The temperature started to come up, and so I plugged the global warming, not now, but 22,000 years ago, where mankind had no industrial power at all. So then by doing so, we ridicule the anthropogenic global warming, because that is applicable. The concept of global warming is applicable when the mankind had no power at all. So this is my approach. So observation. We never bother about the transition, because it was a narrower lapse of time, and so it was not enough to have sediments to be studied. So we ignored the transitional period. We only work on the two periods where you could study. But now they gave me the global warming. Okay, chaps, thank you very much. Boom. And I couple global warming to every glaciation. And they were not absolutely, so you don't even need to talk about CO2. So this is my approach, and I hope one day or another we can solve the problem. I would rather spend the money that I have in other things, but not in this sort of a incredible way of doing, and so many people being involved in it for nothing.
I have one comment on this. This transition which Franco talked about. Of course, for me, that is very important, because we go from a lot of ice to no ice, or to the present type of ice. So enormous amount of ice was melting at a very, very, very high speed. And still, sea level didn't rise more than 1 meter per century. And that figure, 1 meter per century, we can never in present day even come close to it. So anyone saying that it will be 1 meter or more, they don't know what they are talking about. We are talking about centimeters, a decimeter at the most. And that is geology. The other is model speaking, and we don't like that.
That's right. So it's a consensus that's been enforced by people who've not been honest about the data, and it's been very, very exaggerated in recent years.
I think it's two schools. When in geology you have a school, we have all our basic training. We must look in nature itself. From there we make our deductions of what it is. The new school, they wanted to solve a problem which they already knew what it was. To present data which showed that it had been anthropogenic. That is not science. It's modeling, and you can even say it's fiddling with modeling.
Thanks very much, Niels. I know you've got to get back. It's been a real pleasure meeting you guys.
The same.
And the work you're doing is very important for the future of the whole planet and the human race. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to you. Okay, bye-bye then.
Thanks.
Well, back in 2009, I was at the Copenhagen Climate Conference, and I met with some of the top African delegates, and one of them said to me, those people outside, on the TV screen, they're crazy. They're protesting about what might happen in the year 2080. My people need help today. And I said, but don't you think that we're causing dangerous climate change? He said, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but we need help now. So when I got home to Canada, I checked it out on the web. And it turns out the Climate Policy Initiative shows that $1 billion a day, US, is being spent on what's called climate finance. And only 6% of it is going to help people adapt to climate change today. Things like building wells, or moving people to better environments, or helping rebuild homes when they fall down because of permafrost melt, almost certainly because of natural effects. 94% of it, all the money, is going to try to stop climate change that might happen in the distant future. So what progressives don't realize is that by supporting the climate scare, they are actually doing things that run counter to their own normally progressive intentions. Progressives believe in social justice. Okay, they say they do anyways. On this issue, you sort of wonder, because the people who will be hurt in the United States, for example, because of increasing energy costs, because they move away from coal, which is 4 cents per kilowatt hour, to wind and solar that are 22 cents per kilowatt hour, that's going to more than 5 times the price of coal, okay? Or the price of electricity, I should say. And so that's going to hurt the poor. They actually estimate that we're going to see $5 million spent per green job created. And of course, people all across the coal sector are losing their jobs. And the average person across the United States, and indeed across the world, will be paying much, much more for all their food. Everything that uses energy to get it to the store, to grow it, will cost much more if you get rid of your least expensive energy source. And certainly coal is the least expensive. People say, oh, but coal is so dirty. Well, no, that's not true. I mean, if you burn it in a dirty way, you don't use proper advanced pollution control mechanisms, yes, it can be dirty, but coal is in fact, the United States, for example, is the Saudi Arabia of coal. And yet they're getting rid of their least expensive energy source, and this will hurt the poor, And of course, what about wind turbines? I mean, chopping up birds, millions of them in Spain. That doesn't sound very environmentally friendly. Or putting 61-story wind turbines close beside people's homes, people who are going to feel infrasound booming through the wall, making it miserable to live. And in some cases, like a friend of mine, Shelley Correa, she lives in Lincoln County in Ontario, she's going to be forced to move because her son has sensory deprivation disorder. I think it's the proper name. Well, anyway, regardless, it's a problem that is made much worse by the presence of loud noises. And of course, the current premier of Ontario said they wouldn't put wind turbines in places like that, but they're doing it anyways, and she's doing everything she can to stop it. Doctors and others are saying that you can't have people, especially sensitive people, live close to these massive machines, and yet they're being put up everywhere. What about biofuels? The price of food goes up because 6.5% of all the world's grain is now going to make biofuels to supposedly stop climate change. And of course, that affects the poor. So all across the world, we're seeing the poor are suffering the most because of a desire to help people who haven't been born yet on a theory. We know for absolute fact that people need help around the world adapting to normal climate change, adapting to extreme weather, all sorts of things, but they can't get the money because almost all of it's being spent on what might happen, according to computer models, decades in the future. So the left wing have been completely tricked on this. And if they were really serious about helping people, they would encourage they'd be protesting wind turbines. They'd be saying, get rid of these bird choppers, get rid of these machines that are making life miserable for people, and bring in the cheapest form of electricity. Clean it up, make sure it's clean, but use coal or whatever energy source is the least expensive, and electrify the world. 1.2 billion people across the world don't have electricity. That leads to very high mortality rates in poor countries. We need to develop them and help them develop. That's the real climate action that should take part, is on adaptation. It's like that African said to me, he said, I don't know what the future of climate is, but we need help now. And yet almost none of the money's available to them. So I think this is completely ridiculous. And it also violates the fundamental idea that the left are supposed to be skeptics. Those who accepted absolute doctrine, they were generally conservatives, but now it's the other way around. The skeptics can't tolerate debate. The left cannot tolerate debate on this issue, so they've become what they hate.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important thing, because, like I was just saying, that the left and right thing is just a paradigm. Most of these people have been co-opted. It's very clever how this works. It's multi-layered.
Oh, yeah.
And when, it's like your talk really revealed that, how hypocritical the whole thing is when it's analysed, but there's no real analysis going on. There's consensus put out there.
And fear, a lot of fear.
Yeah,
because
course.
People who don't, if they abandon their intellectual fellow travelers, they can lose their jobs. There can be all kinds of negative consequences. Some of our scientists, believe it or not, have had death threats. Death threats for disagreeing with a scientific theory. This is ridiculous. It goes back to the Inquisition, and yet it was the conservatives that are, trying to force things down people's throat. Now it's reversed. It's the left, it's the liberals. But as you point out, it shouldn't be left or right. My dad, as I said in the presentation, is 95, and I asked him, because he had some left-wing ideas and some right-wing ideas, I said, are you left or right? He said, neither. I'm sensible. And I think that's what we have to do, is we have to be sensible. We have to look at the issues, make decisions, and to heck if it's left or right. I don't care. It's, you don't let people suffer and die today when you could help them because of something that might happen. That's just plain stupid. And that's not left or right.
Exactly, but the UN are talking about population reduction, and I think this is actually what it's about.
Well, there's all kinds of ulterior motives. It's an enormous moneymaker for the alternative energy companies, because most of that billion a day is going to alternative energy companies, It's also great for people who believe that we need a world government, that believe we have to have a transfer of wealth, that we in the West have to really cripple our society, and that will somehow help people in the developing world. Where will they get their aid? The whole thing is really driven by many agendas. It is true that some people genuinely believe that we are causing dangerous climate change. But quite frankly, the people who run the movement, they must know enough to know that a lot of this is highly suspect, and that, but they have other objectives.
As we've found out during this conference, and I think the IPCC's summary consensus has been taken apart very successfully here. Reverend Philip Foster, welcome to Windows on the World.
Thank you.
And I've attended this meeting for the last 3 days.
Yes, you have.
Can you just tell me how this was set up, how this initially happened?
Okay, the background of this is that 6 years ago, a group of us, not dissimilar to the group this time, decided we needed to go and be at COP15 in Copenhagen. So, with the help of a couple of friends of mine, one of whom was Danish, who could organise the Danish side of things in Copenhagen, the hall and all that, we did something very similar to today, had scientists speak, and so on and so forth. We were actually working with CFACT at that time as well. So that was, having done that once, it now was the next big one after 6 years. And we were beginning to say, should we do something like that again? And there was, in a sense, a little uncertainty, until I suddenly thought, well, a little bit of money's come my way, not a lot, but I think this is the signal to press for go. So I got on to organising a hall, all very practical, through a website, and this hall became available. We paid our monies and started to invite folk about a couple of months back, and it really somewhat snowballed from there, the people
It's been
who got.
absolutely fascinating, because I've studied some of the IPCC reports, and I've gone into this before, but the level and quality of the information that's been conveyed over the past couple of days is completely outstanding. And brings us to the point of how do we get this across to the wider public now, apart from what we're doing, we know that we had ClimateGate, and that a lot of this stuff's been exposed, but it's on such a corporate and international level, and it's been enforced locally by the UN globally. How do you see the future? What can we actually do now to wake people up to this?
In one way, you're asking the million-dollar question, because I think a lot of us have asked this question: what do you do? What more can we do? I think this time being reminded by Donna Laframboise that, of course, first of all, the reports that come out are not scientific because they've been manipulated by politicians is something that needs, of course, to be conveyed. The issue of you can't fight City Hall mentality, which is a big one because they are immune from prosecutions for the most part. It's very difficult to get at these head folks and the corporates who tend to be supporting them. I don't want to blanket all corporates in that bracket, but I sense they do. It's got to be grassroots upwards, it seems to me. We do try and work with MPs, and there are MPs who are, how can I put it, on board, if that's the right word, but they are few in number, partly because most of our MPs are not scientists, and this is a major difficulty in speaking to them because they have no equipment, really, mental equipment, to handle the issue between good science and bad. This is our real problem, I think. But I don't despair. It's a little bit here, grain of mustard seed, to use a biblical analogy. You just plant a little grain, smallest of all the grains, and it, as Jesus said, it grows up to be one of the biggest trees. So it's a case of working it like that, I think.
I think it's a case of it being the truth, and the truth is paramount. We're all equal under the law. Nobody's above the law, and the UN are acting above the law, and that's clearly been shown.
Yes.
Even by Ed, the lawyer who was here,
Yep,
exposing what they were about, especially with the powers that they've assumed. But to get back to I'd just like to bring you back to this for a minute,
sure.
Because MPs, where I'm in Waltham Forest, the Agenda 21 policies are rampant, and they've now started putting everything into villages, sustainable community developments, basically banning cars on the back of cycling. And I've seen how this has worked, how people have been brought in to build a consensus. People have now realised we didn't have a say in this. However, the local MP for the borough, which I lived in Walthamstow, said she can do nothing about it because these are transport for London policies.
Yes.
How do we get over that? Because it shows total ignorance as to what this is about.
Yeah, I in many senses, this is where you start to flail and feel helpless because, it's past the buck anyway, first of all, and the problem with many politicians, the danger of interviews like this is you make overgeneralized statements, but with many politicians is that they want the job, but they don't want the responsibilities that go with it. And this is true all the way up to the top and all the way down from the top. The great thing is to be able to say, well, actually, no, that's somebody else's department. And if you can play that game, an ordinary person, you or I, trying to, as it were, in ourselves to say, look, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Why can't we stop this because I don't want it? Or whatever it may be, you're just pillar to post, and it's very, very difficult. We have the internet. We have other means of communication. And your point about the fact that no one is above the law, and yet we find there are organizations that are above the law. It's a dangerous thing in a sense, but it's right that we should feel really rather angry about this, and that, in a sense, one has to bring, by what I might call legal means, but as you've got to bring some of these powers down. If I might be flippant for a moment, there's an old saying about the difference. We're in France here, and it's been a delight to be with so many French people at our conference who are free-thinking, people on the climate, and they've been very welcoming. And I was reminded of this ancient saying that somebody wrote about. The difference between the French and the English is that the French march on their capital to rid themselves of a tyrant. The English march on their capital to rid themselves of their tempers. And I feel this is the problem with us English. We have this tendency to get up and do our thing, and then we all go home, and we haven't changed anything. I'm not quite sure how we move up that gear. Maybe watch what the French do.
It's interesting you mention that, because I recently wrote an article called Government Organised Protests, and I found out that the government organises People's Assembly.
Yep.
We're talking about the state organising the protests. So this kind of thing, there was 1 million people on the street the first Iraq War. What did that do? We're now going into Syria. You're saying it's grassroots. I think it is. But yes, getting this through is the most important thing, because I personally believe, I don't know whether you agree with this, or you can give me your response to this, that I think this is the biggest land, property and asset grab ever.
I think you may well be right.
Including the papal bulls of the 1300s, 1306
Yeah.
particularly.
Or even the enclosure movement, or all the other things that went on in our own English history. In a sense, since it's so clear to most people who are reasonably thinking that the science that they are promoting is not science, and it becomes obvious that it's really a means to an end. One, using the grand word global government, which is what lurks in the minds of a lot of these top people, so-called top people. If I might sort of slightly diverge and come back, there was a book I read in the 80s by which I might mention. Her name was called Joan Vion, and she wrote a book called The United Nations Global Straitjacket. And she'd been to all the UN conferences that were goable to in a capacity as a journalist and actually an investment analyst. That was her sort of daytime stuff. But she'd been building up a picture of what had been going on and being passed through in these conferences. And she pinpointed in the 80s something which I only fully woke up to when I got interested in the climate thing, that the key thing the United Nations would use to take control of people's lives is the environment, because that is cross-border. And that was a very potent insight she had. And in a sense, I put it in my pocket and thought about it, but I only made the connections a decade or so later. So in a sense, we are facing that, and I absolutely agree with you about that this is what it's about. It's a land grab. It's basically the people will become the chattels of their masters, and I mean it's as old as the human race, I fear. But this is on a scale I don't think. Well, it's easy to say, I have never seen anything like it, and if you look in history, I don't think even the big empires have ever had this kind of global reach. And the only encouraging thing is that in recent times, the biggest empires, for want of a better word, have collapsed remarkably quickly. The Soviet Empire collapsed in 70 years. The EU will collapse, he said cheerily, probably in the not too distant future. That is sort of, from a human perspective, that is one sort of hope that I would add to my other hopes, that the truth will prevail. But I do have that sort of lurking, which may sound cynical even, but I don't think it is, that sometimes the grand schemes of man have a tendency to backfire. And I suspect this one is increasing. I'm beginning to think I see the symptoms of backfiring beginning at grassroots. One hopes it would not end in violence, if you know what I mean, because I'm not keen on that idea. But sometimes, we can't avoid the possibilities that this may lead to, serious trouble, which I would wish to avoid. So, I mean, those are not necessarily getting us a lot further forward. It's just the sense that human beings can never really fully rule other human beings, because we're all on the same level. We are all ordinary people, and when we set ourselves over against others or above others, in the end, you bring down your own destruction. Looking at it from my Christian perspective, I don't lose sight of the fact that God is in charge of all this. I'm not saying he's running it, but if you understand me, he is over all this. That he may allow this to happen, but it may bring a crunch time. I pray it does.
Thanks for watching Windows on the World. Remember, keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World, and we'll see you soon.